There is a number that football historians still argue about in hushed, almost uncomfortable tones. 1,000 official goals, scored by a single human being in an era of professional football. But the most astonishing part of that number is not the goals themselves. It is that the man who scored them spent half his career being called a liability, a troublemaker, and a player no serious team could afford to trust. To understand how that contradiction is possible, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a hillside neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro where football was not a career path. It was survival. The neighborhood of Jacarezinho was not the kind of place that produced football stars. It was the kind of place that swallowed futures whole, and most children there understood that from a very early age. He was born the seventh of 8 children, in a home where space was measured in centimeters and money was measured in days. His father worked the docks and his mother did whatever was necessary to keep the family fed. From almost the moment he could walk, he had a football at his feet. Not a real one at first. A bundle of rags tied with tape, rolled across dirt and gravel until it barely held its shape. By the time he was a teenager, every adult who watched him play knew they were seeing something different. Something that did not follow normal rules of development or discipline. He was signed by one of Rio's biggest clubs as a youth player, but almost immediately the coaches ran into a problem they had no framework for. He was uncoachable not because he lacked talent, but because he simply knew more about scoring goals than anyone trying to teach him. The tension between his extraordinary ability and his absolute refusal to conform would define every chapter of his life, and it very nearly ended his career before it properly began. If you have ever wondered how a player with this much talent could spend years on the margins, teetering between greatness and complete self-destruction, you are watching the right channel. Follow Football Untold, because every story we tell is the one they did not want you to know. His first national youth call-up came with a warning attached. The Federation selectors told his club in private that they were taking a risk, and that one serious incident of indiscipline would be enough to close the door permanently. What happened next shocked the selectors. Not because of any act of rebellion, but because in front of thousands of spectators at a youth tournament, this teenager from Jacarezinho played as though he had already won everything. The 1984 Los Angeles Olympics would become the moment the world first glimpsed what was coming, even if the world did not fully understand what it was seeing yet. He scored 7 goals in 6 matches for the Brazilian Olympic team. He was 18 years old, and he treated every defender in that tournament as though they were simply not fast enough to exist in the same space as him. Brazil finished with the silver medal, losing to France in a penalty shootout that broke the nation's heart. But when Brazilians talked about that tournament in the years that followed, they always came back to the boy from Jacarezinho. Back home, the club career that followed was an extraordinary contradiction. He could disappear for training sessions for days at a time. He would arrive for matches having slept through the pre-game preparation. And then he would score 2 goals and make it all look effortless. When the call came from Europe, specifically from the Dutch city of Eindhoven, even his harshest critics had to admit it was deserved. One of the most powerful clubs in the world had decided this difficult, complicated, utterly brilliant Brazilian was worth the risk. The years in the Netherlands would transform him in ways nobody could have predicted. Surrounded by a team that was arguably the finest club side on the planet at that moment, something in his game crystallized. He became a European champion. He scored in European finals. He played alongside giants of the game, and not once did he appear to feel out of his depth, because for the first time in his career, the team around him was operating at his level. But the relationship with Europe was never going to be permanent. He was too Brazilian, too free, too allergic to the structured, tactical, intensely disciplined football culture of Northern Europe to ever fully belong there. He returned to Brazil and the goals continued as though he had never been away. But the story that was building toward its defining chapter was not in club football at all. It was on the biggest stage in the sport. The 1994 World Cup in the United States of America would become the tournament that history remembers as his. Not officially, not comfortably, and not without enormous controversy. But undeniably, irrevocably his. He scored 5 goals in 7 matches, was named the player of the tournament, and lifted the World Cup for Brazil for the first time in 24 years. The nation had waited a generation. He delivered in 6 weeks. But the World Cup story has a chapter that is almost never told correctly. Because earlier that year, he had been dropped from the national squad entirely. The federation had had enough of his lifestyle. They sent him home. He returned to Rio. He played club football. And then public pressure, the overwhelming voice of an entire nation, forced the federation to bring him back. The people would not go to the World Cup without him. And the federation knew it. The years after 1994 became something stranger and more complex than a simple decline. He kept scoring at a rate that defied age and logic, at club after club, country after country. At the age of 39 he scored his 1000th official goal, a moment that the football world marked with a strange mixture of awe and skepticism, as though nobody could quite bring themselves to fully accept what they were witnessing. His relationship with the Brazilian national team would remain complicated long after his playing days ended. The federation found ways to minimize his legacy. He found ways to be impossible to erase. What he left behind is not simply a number, though the number is extraordinary. He left behind a philosophy. The idea that a footballer from the very bottom of society, from the dust and concrete of a Rio favela, could refuse every system ever designed to contain him and still reach the absolute summit of the sport. Generations of Brazilian forwards grew up studying not just his goals but his posture. The way he occupied space. The way he communicated with defenders using stillness before the explosion. He created a school of thought that continues to shape the game today. He never apologized for who he was. He never pretended the rules applied to him the same way they applied to others. And the most remarkable part of his story is that when everything was on the line, when Brazil needed a miracle, he was always the one standing in the light. There are stories in football that the record books tell well. And then there are the stories that live in the spaces between the statistics, in the alleys of Jacarezinho, in the arguments of federation officials, in the roar of a nation that needed one impossible man to be exactly who he was. If this kind of story is what you come to football for, then you already know what to do. Follow Football Untold, and never let the real story stay buried.